Just before we get this study on Discover the Word started, I want to ask you to do us a favor. We are so thankful for the opportunity to explore the Scriptures with you here on Discover the Word. For some of you, for decades. As a Bible engagement effort of Our Daily Bread Ministries, I know all of us here, both at the table and behind the scenes, have found it to be a life-changing and life-enriching thing to explore the story and wisdom of the Bible with you, discovering Jesus in the pages of Scripture together. Well, today I'm inviting you to share your feedback about what Discover the Word means to you. Please take our online survey so that we can continue meeting your needs and making improvements. And then to express our gratitude, once you complete the survey, you'll be able to pick one complimentary book from either Bill Crowder or Elisa Morgan. We look forward to hearing from you. That's just our way of saying thanks. And you can access the survey at discovertheword.org. That's discovertheword.org. There's a banner up at the top of the page at discovertheword.org. Discover the Word's Bill Crowder on why, over and over again, he's drawn to the Old Testament collection of Psalms.
It seems like for almost any struggle we face in life, there's a psalm for that.
Yeah, for almost every struggle we face in life, there's a psalm for that. To me, that seems pretty spot on, doesn't it? There are praise psalms. There are psalms of thanksgiving. There are also lament psalms and wisdom psalms and psalms that are a combination of all the styles. Yeah, psalms for almost every situation in life. And so in this episode, Bill says,
I want to direct our thinking in this set of conversations to Psalm 61.
And so what kind of psalm is Psalm 61? And what kind of struggle in life does it provide help and perspective in? Well, Bill Crowder, Elisa Morgan, Daniel Ryan Day, and Vivian Nabuni are your study partners for another hour of engaging the Bible together on Discover the Word. Next. Well, hi, I'm Brian Hettinga. Welcome to Discover the Word, a Bible engagement from Our Daily Bread Ministries. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. And so what kinds of struggles are front of mind for you right now? What kinds of situations are wearing you down and have you hoping for relief and resolution and a renewed sense of safety and security? Well, as Bill mentioned, we're going to go to Psalm 61 for this edition of the podcast for a study we're calling Real Security. And I think we'll find that help and perspective and encouragement that we so often find in the Psalms.
Have you ever had some specific experiences where you were just absolutely worn down and worn out? And if so, do you feel comfortable sharing about it and what kind of triggered that?
I have a basket right now in my office full of papers. My admin just it drains the life out of me. Papers and stuff. I know that that's not exactly what you're talking about, Bill, but
that's close enough.
Yeah, admin and details.
Yeah. Lisa?
Yeah, I'm thinking about family stuff, and I try so hard to not carry it on my shoulders. There have been so many seasons of life where God's gone, Elisa, I've got this. And it's like he wants to lift it up off my shoulders, just like 6 inches, assuring me that he's got it. It's not all mine to fix or all mine to carry, meaning the lives of friends, the lives of family members, the lives of, me and my husband, just things going on. And I just have this stunning tendency to grab it all and push it right back down on my shoulders and, bend under the weight of it. And it is exhausting. It really is.
Yeah. And for me, I'm in a week that kind of feels a little bit tiring and overwhelming in some ways. Just there's been a lot of sickness in our house. And as a result of that, trying to navigate work and family. And then there's been other things, other pressures kind of coming in from outside our immediate family that I've had to deal with this week and stuff like that. So I feel like I'm kind of coming into our time together, Bill, a little bit worn out. So I hope you have some encouragement for us, and it's not going to be just a time of lament today.
Well, I certainly believe that we've got some encouragement coming our way, because it seems like for almost any struggle we face in life, there's a psalm for that. And I want to direct our thinking in this set of conversations to Psalm 61. Psalm 61 is a psalm of David, and you can hear in there, he is just under it. He's worn out and he's worn down, and he's looking to God to be his help and his hope, and living under a time of immediate threat to his life. He's looking to his God to be his security as well. So that's kind of the 30,000 foot view of where we're going in these conversations. But I'd like for us to start out, if we could, just by reading through the entire psalm. There's only 8 verses, so we can each take 2 and work our way through it. And if y'all don't mind, I'll just go ahead and start it off. For the choir director on a stringed instrument, a psalm of David. Hear my cry, O God, give heed to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I.
For you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe. I long to dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings.
God, you've heard my vows. You have given a heritage to those who fear your name. Add days to the king's life. May his years span many generations.
May he be enthroned forever before God. Appoint steadfast love and faithfulness to watch over him. So I will always sing praises to your name as I pay my vows day after day.
Okay, as we were reading through that, I hope you were listening for the key words that describe kind of the mess that David's in at this point. And as you could tell from the superscription, there's some musical instructions, and then it designates it a Psalm of David. But it doesn't give us a historical narrative to support why David feels this way. Normally, when we have David, his heart faint, he's running for his life, he's got enemies out to get him. Normally, scholars classify that either as when he was pursued by Saul or when he was pursued by his son Absalom. But I think we can be more specific here, because he refers to himself as the king, and when Saul was pursuing him, he was not yet the king. He had been anointed as a boy, as we know, but he had not taken office as king. This seems to be in the time when he's being pursued by his own son, trying to take him from the throne. And that immediately made me think of your comment, Elisa, about family stuff being exhausting. Family situations can be so complicated. And here you have David and his son, who is serving as his absolute foe in this situation. And that would not only be exhausting, I suspect it would be pretty heartbreaking as well.
Yeah.
And to take that home, too, if anybody's ever been opposed, by a team member or a dear friend or somebody who works in the same organization. I mean, in addition to family, I've just at times been so stunned, and it feels like a betrayal, and you feel so alone, and you question, what did I do? And lots of times the Lord leads us to things. I need to take a closer look at this area of my life, and we're smart to do so. But there are other times when it just feels like a barrage of unnecessary and unfair attack.
Yeah. Let's just look for this conversation at the first 2 verses. I'll just repeat them. Hear my cry, O God, give heed to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. Now, when my heart is faint, that's the problem. What has created it or caused it is part of the problem, but the condition that he's in right now is the problem of being in despair, of being weary of life to a degree. And when you hear him say that, my heart is faint, does that resonate with your own experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I hear in that word like lack of energy, lack of strength, a weariness where you just hope something's going to finally come to an end, or you feel like you might if it doesn't come to an end. An anxiety, a stress, like all of that seems tied into that idea of weariness that makes it feel like it's hard to live in some ways, like your heart's beating, sometimes beating too fast, or in this case, it almost feels like beating too slow because you're just worn out by everything happening.
Yeah.
And those who have a physical ailment, in their heart, I think they can really resonate here. If you have AFib or, my daughter struggles with enough oxygen in her blood, it affects you in such a physical way that you can't deny it. You can't put it aside. And so even if it's metaphorical here for David, I think that metaphor really gives us the sense of it's out of our control and it's abnormal.
Yeah, I think that there's a difference between doing something with a good tired. Like sometimes we can put in a hard day's work and we might be tired, but it's a kind of a good tired. And this to me seems like a type that there's no hope in it. Like there's just this weight and burden. And I think it's significant that throughout the scriptures, even Old Testament, New Testament, there is this idea of let your heart not grow faint in doing good. Those ideas, because we are prone to being faint or having a faint heart.
And with all of those things that you guys have said, when his heart is faint, his response to that, hear my cry, O God, give heed to my prayer. He doesn't just dwell on it or, in a sense, wallow in it. I mean, he's in a bad place, but he knows where to go with this thing, to whom he needs to take it. And one commentary said that when cry and prayer are linked together, it's there to show the urgency and the desperation of the moment.
Yeah.
And that seems to fit with what David's describing in the rest of the psalm.
Yeah, especially with the way verse 2 starts, from the end of the earth I call to you. That's a phrase that shows up a lot in the scriptures. Like Moses, for example, right, goes beyond the wilderness, right? So he's in the wilderness and then he ends up on the other side of the wilderness. And it's this like place of desperation and stress and trying to figure life out and all of that. So here you have David also saying like, I'm as far away as I can feel in some ways from maybe even from you, God.
Yeah.
I'm at the end of myself. I'm in a place of desperation. I need your help.
Yeah, and that's exactly what one scholar said, that phrase, from the end of the earth, was a metaphor for alienation and spiritual distance from the Lord. And that's very vivid, like you say, Daniel. I mean, it's kind of like, not only am I at the end of myself, I'm at the end of the world. And still, from this great distance, Lord, you're the only one I can turn to, and you're the only one who I can trust to be my help in this situation.
Yeah.
And so, Bill, then he goes, lead me to the rock that is higher than I.
Yeah.
Is that a metaphor there? And what is the significance of that? I'm thinking Jack Beck here and the geographical references.
Well, that's really good, because it is a metaphor, but it's also a practicality. And actually, we'll get more into that in our next conversation. But hold on to that question, Elisa, because that's a really important question as we break down the next couple of verses in our next talk together. A major issue in today's world is the issue of security, and it's an issue on a variety of different levels. What are some of the things that come to your mind when you hear that word security? And by that I mean personally, nationally, globally. What do you think of when you hear security?
I think of like data security and how it feels like every week we hear some story about a data breach, and we probably all have received mail from a mortgage company or a bank or somebody that says, hey, we saw some kind of activity happening and information may have been compromised. So just how difficult that is in today's world to protect information and how easy it is for ID theft and all of those types of things to happen.
Sure. I think of all of the travesties of shootings, around us. We, especially in America, we presume security. We presume that we can walk into a mall or a football game or a school and be safe, because safety is equal to security, in our minds. And it should be that way in a civilized society. But more and more in our present day realities, that notion is being challenged, and it shakes us all up deeply. Every time you see something, it's like, I never thought that here in blank city, in blank state, I would see this.
Yeah. I think of just safe as far as in our homes. and, locks and motion sensor lighting. A lot of people have the Ring doorbells so that they can see the activity that's going on. But there's a sense of being able to sleep at night because I feel safe. And if I don't feel safe, it hinders my ability to actually relax and rest in a place that's supposed to be a haven or a place of security.
And to take that to an emotional level, I think we sometimes feel that in our relationships as well. We thought we could trust someone, and then they turn on us, and suddenly we're like, "Whoa! I thought I was safe with you." We use those words, and you're not safe anymore to me emotionally, and that really throws us, doesn't it?
Yeah, it doesn't take much because, again, all of these things do impact us emotionally as well as psychologically. I mean, the impact of a sudden lack of security on our overall well-being can be really tough. And once again, that's kind of where we're going with King David in Psalm 61. So, Lisa, would you read for us Psalm 61, verses 2 through 4?
Sure. From the ends of the earth I call to you. I call as my heart grows faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For you've been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe. I long to dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. I just want to sigh right there.
Yeah. Okay, so in our last conversation, Elisa, you asked a question, and I'm going to open the door for you to repeat that question if you're still interested.
I was struck, and we were talking about how David felt as if he was at the ends of the earth, how his heart was growing faint, and we were experiencing that ourselves in our own exhaustions. And then at the end of verse 2, he says, lead me to the rock that is higher than I, and he goes into this language about safety. And I just was asking you, what's the meaning of the rock? Is it symbolic? Is it metaphorical? Is it literal? What is David getting at there?
Well, I believe what he's getting at is there's safety in higher ground. In the ancient world, this is something I learned the first time I went to the Bible lands, and I've held on to it. It's one of those things that it just keeps popping up different places like here. And Jack Beck, when he's been with us before, he's kind of reinforced this as well. But when they were in the ancient world looking to locate a city, they were looking for three things. They wanted a water supply, they wanted to be near major roads for commerce, and they wanted it to be on high ground so that you could see danger coming from a long ways away. And I think that when he says, lead me to the rock that is higher than I, he's using that as a metaphor of not only do I want higher ground, I want the highest ground. The rock that is higher than him pictures the safety and security that's found in God himself. And there is no greater security than that.
Yeah.
Well, I love the word tower too, that it keeps on going to talk, because that's the same thing. A tower's built up high, and we enter that and we're protected there.
Okay, and keep in mind that towers were not necessarily there for you to go into and be protected. They were there from which you struck your defense.
Right.
So there's this big picture image of higher ground and a tower of strength. But then when you drop down to verse 4, there's a much more intimate picture there. What's that say, Daniel, in verse 4?
Yeah, let me abide in your tent forever, find refuge under the shelter of your wings.
Okay.
So we have like two parallel ideas there. One being that the idea of the tent or the tabernacle, that this psalm is attributed to David, and under David's rule, there was not a temple yet. And so God was still dwelling in tents with his people. And David actually felt the tension of that and wanted to build God a house. And God said, not yet, because I'm dwelling with my people in a tent. And so the tabernacle was that center of worship. So there's this sense in which David's longing to be with God in his tabernacle, in his tent, in his place of presence, the presence of God as his protection. And then the shadow of the wings, we had a series we did on the mother side of God. And in that, we talked about this metaphor that shows up throughout the Old Testament of God as a mother bird that protects its younglings under its wings. And so we see that kind of played on here as well. So it is a very tender, very intimate, the very presence of God is the thing that is protecting and loving and comforting in the midst of the stress that David's experiencing.
So you have the rock that is strong and apart from me, and then you have the tent where David wants to dwell and the shelter of your wings. Now, Daniel, you may be 100% right on the wings because we've talked about that before, as you said. But in the tabernacle was the Holy of Holies, where there was the Ark of the Covenant, which was overshadowed by the wings of the cherubim.
Wow. Yep.
And so, as not being a high priest, David would not have access to the Holy of Holies. But what he's saying is, that's the level of intimacy I want with my God. I want to dwell in the shadow of his wings in the Holy of Holies. And with that, feel that intimate connection that you're talking about as well, Daniel. I think it's just beautiful wordsmithing here that David's doing for us. He's pretty good at this poetry stuff.
He is. And I keep thinking about him being king. And he's like, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. He was already at the top and recognizing, again, his need for the Lord. And so I think it's so easy for us when we are in places of influence or power to think that it all ends with us rather than recognizing that there is a God who is higher. And when I read the shelter of the wings too, in addition to the cherubim, which I think is so profound, I have a picture in my mind right now in the San Bernardino Mountains. There's a nest that has a 24-hour camera, the web camera of these two bald eagles, and they have 3 eggs. And just we had snow and rain recently, and for 81 hours, this mother eagle protected the eggs and kept the eggs warm under the shelter of her wings. And it was just, you see the bird, huge bird covered in snow. And I think that's the safest place to be is under the wings of the care of a tender God.
That's beautiful. One thing I do want you to notice is that when David prays for these things, he's just not pulling ideas out of thin air. He's drawing on past experience, because in verse 3 he says, "For you have been a refuge to me." I'm not asking for something new. Lord, you've carried me through other difficult times, and I know you're more than capable of carrying me through this difficult time. And I think that's one of the valuable lessons we learn from David. When he would be faced with challenges, he would reach into the catalog of memory of times when he had other challenges and God had come to his aid. I think maybe most profoundly when he offered to go face up against Goliath, and the king said, "You're just a kid, you can't do this." And he said, "Hold on a minute. There was this bear and there was this lion, and they came to take my father's sheep. And the Lord strengthened me, and I took them both down. And the same God who strengthened me then is going to strengthen me now." And I just think building up that reservoir of past experiences with God that we can pull from to say, "Lord, here I am again, and I'm praying that you'll do it again because I know you can."
And I hope that was encouraging and calming for you today to reflect with the group on how we can find our safety and our security in trusting God. Going back to that reservoir of God's faithfulness, that's a helpful image. It's where David goes in Psalm 61, and it's where you and I can go today as well. You're part of the Discover the Word group with Bill Crowder, Elisa Morgan, Vivian Mabuni, and Daniel Ryan Day for this study called Real Security in Psalm 61. So would you say that you learn to trust God more in the good times when things are going great and smooth? Or would you say that some of the biggest growth spikes in your life, the things that shaped you the most, were in times that were the most difficult? Well, in the next segment, they're going to find something in this psalm that David wrote about the value of tough times. But first, a quick reminder. Just going to take a moment to remind you that we'd like you to share your feedback about what Discover the Word means to you by taking a survey that we have a link to on our website. Because you are part of this Bible study group. You have a spot at the table with us. And we want to know more about what's important to you, your favorite parts, your not so favorite parts of studying with us. please take our online survey so we can continue meeting your needs and making improvements. You can access our survey at discovertheword.org. There's a banner up at the top of the page that you can click on. Again, go to discovertheword.org. And now let's listen as Bill leads Elisa and Daniel and Vivian in this study of Psalm 61 to reflect on some things that they've learned in life's difficult times that can contribute to the real security theme that we see in this psalm.
One of the things that maybe is a positive benefit of difficult times, though one that we don't necessarily, I think, value perhaps like we should, is that we can learn a lot about ourselves as we go through difficult experiences. Can you think of some experiences in your background where you've learned a lot about yourself?
I have so many. So many. I've had a lot of experience, Bill.
I've definitely learned from experiences where things didn't go well, either because the leader that I was under didn't really care about the people that he was leading. That situation in particular comes to mind and how that's shaped how I then try now to lead because of how I was treated in those experiences. And so try to learn from those experiences. And I think sometimes I apply it well and sometimes I don't.
Yeah.
That's good.
For me, what I realize is that I learn the most in the hardest times. And sometimes it's from without, and then sometimes it's from within. One of the things that I was surprised about is that I'm just very pain adverse. Like I like Novocaine and the epidural during birth. Like I just don't enjoy pain very much.
Good. That's normal.
Yeah, that's normal. I take Advil. But what I realized, though, during my cancer journey was that there was an ability to actually need to trust deeper, and that brought out this sense that I can actually do hard things.
Yeah.
And I tend to shy away from pain, but in the middle of it, realizing that, there are places that I have not accessed. And between...
That's really positive, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a positive twist to it sometimes, is what I'm saying. And it's not just always me reacting to things from without, but also even from within, realizing something about myself. And so that was what popped into my mind. Sometimes our hardest times bring out some gold.
Yeah, that reminds me, Vivian, of a quote that I read by Julian of Norwich, who was a leader in the more medieval church. But she wrote that if we knew when the end was coming, we would set a limit to our patience. But by not knowing the end, our patience is developed through struggle. And it's surprising what we can handle when we go through hard things. And sometimes that's the lesson that we learn by experiencing pain and suffering is, wow, I can handle a lot more than I thought.
Yeah. Mine is so basic and dumb compared to what you guys are talking about, but I'm going to say it anyway. When I was in college, I played intercollegiate soccer, and I was a goalkeeper. And I've said many times, especially when talking to young people, to be a goalkeeper, you have to be very courageous and not very smart because you're constantly throwing your body in harm's way. In the course of one season, I had a broken leg, several cracked ribs, a separated shoulder, and a concussion, and I only missed one game, which goes to the not very smart part. Because
you
today,
were committed, Bill. Wow.
Well, or I should have been, one or the other. But I mean, I wanted to play. It was fun. And yet now, as I look back 50 years later, and I'm a little bit of a wreck because I learned the very hard way how foolish it can be to be reckless. And again, that's not a real profound spiritual lesson like you guys are describing, but it was a painful one that I learned. So we return to Psalm 61. We're seeing David in a season of fatigue and despair. And as we've been reflecting on stuff from our past, he reflects on stuff from his past as well. but not just what they taught him about himself, what those past experiences taught him about his relationship with God. Vivian, would you read Psalm 61, verse 5, please?
Sure. For you have heard my vows, O God. You have given me the inheritance of those who fear your name.
Okay, notice how both of those point back to the past. You have heard my vows. You have given me inheritance. It's like we saw in our last conversation, you have been a refuge for me. He's pulling out of that reservoir of memories again. And here, there are a couple little nuances I'd like to just throw at you and see what you think. Because one scholar said there's an implied ask in each one of these things. You have heard my vows, O God. Hear them again. Mm-hmm. You have given me the inheritance of those who fear your name. Give me that inheritance once more. You know, he's got one hand holding on to the past and one hand reaching out to the future. And he's trusting God to bridge that, both in relationship to hearing David's vows, and those speak of human vows, vows that David has made to be faithful, to be obedient, to be a true worshiper of his God, which we know David's story all too well, and we know, not surprisingly, he was not able to live those things out perfectly, but he lived them out to a point of aspiration where God referred to him as a man after my own heart.
Yeah, that word, Bill, kind of trips us up to the idea of vows, because we typically only think of that in a setting of formal commitments, wedding vows, or a vow of office, or something like that. But it seems, especially in the Old Testament, to be used pretty regularly for just making a commitment to God in words in some way. And so in that way, all of us, when we decide to follow Jesus, have made a vow by saying, I'm going to follow you with my life. And in the same way that people that have gone before us struggled to keep those vows to God at times, we also struggle. But there is still this sense in which I'm trying to follow you the best I can. And I have made this, promise and commitment to follow you. And it includes the other vows we make, right? Like if we did take a public office and make a vow, then we are making that vow before God and others. And so we would aim to keep that. But in this sense, it's probably much more of a like everyday commitment and promise. Sometimes we'll see like Jacob make a vow that if you do this for me, God, I'll do this for you.
Yeah. And it feels to us like they're bargaining with God, but that's really not, I think, what was happening in that culture. What was happening in that culture was, I'm making you this promise, God, and I'm going to do my best to live up to it. But here's what I need from you if I'm going to be able to get it done. I mean, there's a sense of reliance in there. And when we first started this psalm, we saw David in despair. He was faint of heart, and his response was to pray. And again, in the Old Testament, it was not uncommon to have prayers accompanied by vows. So we make a request and then we give a statement of commitment to go along with that request. Again, that feels very foreign to us, but that was kind of the culture that David was in.
Well, maybe the expression or the practice might feel foreign to us, but what I'm starting to experience as we're digging into this psalm is how much this is a relationship, how much this is me reaching out to God, receiving from him, giving to God, learning from him. It's a relationship. It's not a one and done thing. This is an ongoing dependency, and then learning from where we slip or where we suffer or where we're strong, and applying it and digging in deeper and continuing. And that's incredibly encouraging to me to see that rhythm in David's life as well.
Yeah, that's really good.
I think, too, just his remembering, like, I remember that you did this and do it again. You have done this in the past, do it again. And it reminds me how I was freaking out because I was out of town with my husband, and I was worried that our daughter had forgotten to feed the dog and couldn't figure out where she was with location. And my husband was just like, has she ever done anything to cause you to think that she wouldn't take care of the dog? And I just thought,
good.
You know what? I just needed, and it turned out that she had asked a friend to come and feed the dog. So there's all this other stuff that was going on that I didn't understand, but I needed to remember from the past. And I think we forget God's faithfulness to us in the past, his provision in the past. And so this exercise that David is doing is so valuable, I think, for us to implement as well.
When he says, you've given me the inheritance or the heritage of those who fear your name, just touch on that real quickly. Much of the time in Israel, the heritage referred directly to the land. And remember, David is the king, but he's fleeing for his life, we believe, being pursued by his son Absalom. And so he feels disconnected from that promise, disconnected from that heritage. And it's not only the land, but it was oftentimes primarily the land. But it was also, in addition to the land, it was the blessings and benefits of living in relationship with God, like you were talking about, Elisa. And I think David, perhaps more than any other Old Testament character, really seemed to cultivate that intimacy and relationship with God. And I just think it's a beautiful thing for him to lean into in his season of despair.
Studying Psalm 61 together here on Discover the Word. And I think a study like this is why, as Bill said earlier in the podcast, we are so drawn to the Psalms. What did he say? There's a psalm for almost every struggle we face in life. Yeah, I hope this psalm, Psalm 61, is speaking perspective and encouragement into your life. Well, next, we're going to be talking about how hope is such a key part of this real security that we find in Psalm 61. But what is hope? At least the biblical kind of hope that David was talking about. Is it simply wishing and hoping for the best? I've heard that in most situations, that kind of hope is really not a very good strategy. And so, Bill, how about you give us a definition of hope as we head into this part of the conversation? I think that'd be helpful.
Hope is not wishes and happy thoughts. Hope is a robust expectation of God living into his character. And within hope, there's an element of trust that the God who is not only can show up, but according to his purposes, he will show up.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Bill. I think that will help. And I think we'll come back to that after this next part of the conversation and reinforce what David and really the Bible as a whole mean by hope. So let's listen.
When our circumstances are difficult and wearisome, how do we maintain hope?
Just got to make it happen. Is that the right answer?
Yeah, I don't think we're getting there yet. Vivian, you got anything quite better for us?
Well, I'll take a stab. Honestly, when I find my circumstances difficult, hope gets restored when I spend time with other like-minded believers, people who remind me of what's true and what I'm really all about, and it kind of sets my circumstances back. So I'm such a huge believer that God hardwired us to live in community because we so need each other. Left to myself, my mind can wander and I can start to catastrophize situations and circumstances. But when I'm with other believers who are just, they understand and they're sold out to the truth that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And those kinds of conversations, they just put my circumstances into a correct perspective. Yeah. That restores hope for me.
I love that,
for
Viv.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, perspective really is a big part of it. It's not just, happy thoughts or the power of positive thinking or us convincing ourselves that it's really not as bad as it is. It really is the perspective of the size of my problem compared to the size of my God. And that's where David takes us once again. We've heard him talk very frankly about his fears, his faint-heartedness, his despair, his feeling of alienation, his feeling of lack of safety and security. And now, suddenly, in verses 6 and 7 of Psalm 61, he starts using the language of hope. This might be where my situation is, but this is what God's going to do. And he says it with, I think, a high degree of confidence. So who'd like to read verses 6 and 7 for us?
I can do that.
Okay.
Prolong the life of the king. May his years endure to all generations. May he be enthroned forever before God. Appoint steadfast love and faithfulness to watch over him.
Now, my translation's a little different. In it, it says, you will prolong the king's life. It's not just the king's life's going to be long. It's going to be as long as God wants it to be. His years will be as many generations. We'll talk about that in a minute. He will abide before God forever. All of these are statements looking into the future of what he's anticipating God's response to his prayers to be. And I think maybe the kicker in all this that really brings it to life, largely for us because of so many past conversations, is he asks God to appoint chesed, loving kindness, and faithfulness to preserve the king. He asks God for specific pieces of God's character and attributes to come to his protection and help.
You know, I'm thinking about a practice that I've read about recently in a spiritual formation book, talking about, you know, each day waking up and consciously praying with God, God, you are good. You are good. And then, God, you are loving. You are loving. And how that, and it's a perspective adjustment, you know, to remember the character of God, that much the way we've been talking about here. And it just starts you out with a way of, instead of, you know, where's the shoe going to drop and when am I going to mess up and how's God going to get me, which is our human tendency. And then we march along through our day without him. Just, okay. Yeah. It shifts the perspective into God wants me to understand his character and to live out that character without fear, you know, in the security that his character is not shifting. It's not going to change. It's going to endure for all generations, even in my life.
When he says his years will be as many generations, that's not him asking to be able to live forever on this earth. I think that's a prayer he offers for his family to come. And some think he's even anticipating the promise that God had already given him of one of his heirs who would rule and reign on the throne of his father David forever. And we know that that king would be Jesus himself. And so, you know, it's interesting when you see something tucked away in a psalm, or really a fairly obscure psalm, actually. But still, the story of the Bible always points to Jesus. And here, once again, it seems to be doing that. And I think it's fantastic.
One of the pieces in this that jumps out to me is may he be enthroned forever before God. Or, Bill, in your translation, abide before God.
Mine says in God's presence forever.
Yeah. I'm curious, as you've been just sitting with this, how do we get our minds around what that means, especially with the language of like forever, right? Because that's a lot longer than David's going to live.
Yeah, and I think you're posing a really challenging question, Daniel, so thanks a lot. No, I think one of the things that's hard for us is it's easy for us on this side of the cross and the empty tomb to conflate what we know about eternity onto what writers in the Old Testament said about eternity. And to say the very least, they had a very incomplete view of what happened after death. And because of that, they came up with all kinds of principles to explain why life stunk as much as it did. And those principles never really worked on a practical level, but they were kind of like theological ideals that gave them a way of explaining away stuff. And so, for instance, in Psalm 73, we have the Psalm of Asaph, and he's talking about the wicked, wealthy, and all the stuff, and how they have no fear of God in their eyes, and they say, what's God going to do about this? God can't do anything about this. And they are basing everything on what they see in the here and now. But the tipping point for Asaph in Psalm 73 comes when he says he was in despair and he was on the verge of giving up, but then he went into the place of worship. And as Derek Kidner said, he ceased to view God as an object of speculation and saw him as an object of hope. And he began to realize in the remaining verses of Psalm 73 that there's more that's coming after this life, and many of our questions in this life won't be answered until in the next life. And as frustrating as that may be for us, it helps to at least know that. I mean, at this point, David didn't even know that. And I think it makes a statement like that about forever maybe the ultimate aspiration. I don't know how. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to make it work. But God, somehow, some way, your presence is not just where I want to be right now in this season of trial, but I want to be there forever, whatever that means. I think there's probably more questions in his statement than there are answers, but they're all ultimately laced up, I think, with hope.
Yeah. And I wonder, too, if maybe that language of before God refers a little bit to the accountability that he feels. There's kind of a sense in which he rules before God first and foremost. And in the same way that we would say that we live for God first and foremost, that doesn't mean we don't also look out for our own needs or the needs of others or love others or care for others, but our accountability, the thing that we're living for first and foremost, is for God. And God's the only one that can pull everything together so that it actually works for his glory, for the good of the world and our good.
Yeah.
But I almost wonder if maybe that's part of what David is pulling on here too, is I'm enthroned before God first and foremost, which would make sense if he's stressed out and anxious and overwhelmed by the circumstances he's in and wants to know that ultimately God is his protector as well. That would maybe play in here too. But I wonder if that's part of what's going on here too.
I think it makes a lot of sense, Daniel, and I think what you're describing is something that in our generation I've heard sometimes referred to as living before the audience of one. That ultimately we live our lives before him and in his presence, and it's to him that we are ultimately answerable and to him that we ultimately depend and rely.
I think that is so helpful to think about this concept of hope. You know, as you're saying it, David is both living in God's presence and also asking God to help him live in his presence. There's this both and there. And we look at these verses, as we do all the Psalms, we make them all about us. And then we put this context of who was David and what was he going through. And then we also have the benefit of looking at the eventual king, the eternal king, Jesus the king. And we have, honestly, a higher capacity to hope because we understand the eternal king and living in the audience of that one who's already on the throne. It really is rich.
Yeah, a really good part of the conversation there about why hope is such a key part of Psalm 61 and our discussion about real security. And so I said that we would revisit that definition of hope that Bill gave us before we started that part of the conversation. And so having that as background now, see if Bill's definition is even more meaningful and helpful in trusting God to be our real security.
Hope is not wishes and happy thoughts. Hope is a robust expectation of God living into his character. And within hope, there's an element of trust that the God who is not only can show up, but according to his purposes, he will show up. And I think the thing that separates wishing and hoping from biblical hope is that biblical hope has expectation attached to it.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That clarification about what biblical hope is really important. Well, one more 10-minute segment left in our study of Psalm 61. There's been a lot of lament in this psalm, but next we'll discover that it ends in praise. So a praise conversation that I think you'll be encouraged by, and our hope is that it will draw some things out of you that'll cause you to praise God for how he has worked and how he is working in your life. All right, that comes up after we take a peek ahead at the subject of our next podcast. We talk often on Discover the Word about the big story the Bible is telling. And so for the next two podcasts, we've asked author Megan Good to join us to walk through the story of Scripture.
I love telling the story of the Bible, so I'm really excited to have this conversation and do the Bible in 10 parts.
Yeah, and we're excited to have her with us. Knowing the overarching story of the Bible helps us to know where the different parts fit into the story. And that is super important in being able to read and understand the Bible well. So, the story of Scripture with Megan Good on our next two Discover the Word podcasts. And now let's conclude our conversation about Psalm 61 with, like the psalmist, a time of praise and thanks to God. As Bill and Elisa and Daniel and Vivian tell us about some times that the Lord injected a dose of joy into their life, and they just had to find ways to praise Him for it.
Okay, we've been journeying together through Psalm 61 this week, and we've seen David experiencing some very difficult and challenging times, and some of that takes on the characteristics of a lament. But one of the characteristics of David's Psalms of lament is that they start off in lament and they end in praise. And I'm happy to say that, like David, we're going to end in praise in Psalm 61. So to kick off our thinking a little bit, when was a time that your heart was so full of gratitude and praise to God that you just thought you might burst?
I have a real bold one that just pops in my mind. I did an ugly cry. It was that kind of a moment, but it's when my son got married. And I remember the moment that he walked me down the aisle and I sat in my spot and we all stood up as the men came out, and it was like my grandson, followed by my nephew, followed by these precious men that I had known, followed by my son, followed by my husband who was going to marry them. And then I turned around and watched his bride come down the aisle. And it's like, and my daughter as her bridesmaid. And it's like everybody I loved in one moment. And I was overwhelmed with God's love for us all right there.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Your cup runneth over.
I had a recent situation at church where we have this moment in the service where all the kids grab the offering that's collected in the back and then bring it forward in the middle of the service. And so there's always this big gaggle of kids. And so I was like officiating the service. So they handed me the offering. And then this one girl named Maggie, she just stops for a second and goes, "I want to tell you something." I was like, "Sure, what is that?" "I think you're amazing." It was like the most sweet moment ever. And after church, I went and found her and just told her how meaningful that was to me. And I was like, "That's the kindest thing." And she said, "Well, I have lots more kind things to say to you, but I'll save them for later."
That's awesome.
That just happened, and that was a great moment. So.
I love that. That's awesome. My moment, there's several moments, but one that really sticks out to me is when my middle son, Michael, was born. My first son was an emergency C-section. I had a abruptio placenta. He almost died. I almost died. Very scary. So they put me under and performed emergency C-section. So I was never part of the birth. So was able to deliver Michael naturally and see him be born. And so that moment, I just burst out into tears and held this sweet little baby and just kept crying and thanking God, just for his health and the delivery and the whole experience.
That's awesome.
Was really significant.
Well, I've got a couple of things, and I'll do them real quickly because I don't want to monopolize this, but our oldest son, Matt, was very similar. We almost lost him at birth. Marlene was in labor for like 36 hours, and he was so big she just couldn't push him down and just about lost him. And then 20 years later, plus a couple, 9/11 happens, and my son Matt is so patriotic, and he immediately went and enlisted in the Army. His first deployment was to Afghanistan, and he was a gunner on a convoy. And it was just months and months of terror for us. And then when he came home, there was just such a sense of celebration that God had protected him and kept him safe through that whole experience. And I thought my heart was going to explode inside of me. I was so happy and thankful. The other, there was a period of time about 20 years ago where we were drowning in a tsunami of debt. Some of that debt was due to some bad decisions I had made. Some of it was not our fault. And when something happened out of the clear blue sky that brought the first moment of relief to all that pressure, I was so happy all I could do was cry. I just sat and cried for about an hour at God's goodness, just at his kindness to help us in a situation that was partly my fault, and he came to our rescue. So in those times when you have one of those overwhelming moments of gratitude to God, how do you express that?
It's interesting because even as you're sharing, Bill, I'm getting all teary-eyed hearing your stories, but I think we just naturally weep. The intensity of the emotion is only expressed through tears. They're happy tears, they're grateful tears, but they're still tears.
Yeah, I also try to write down things when they're really big moments like that too, so I can look at them again later.
That's good.
Which really laces us back into this whole conversation of, how do we continue on in our relationship with God when we're disappointed by life, when we fail, when we're in a really desperate place, and to remember his faithfulness to us. And we've all shared these moments. They're not everyday moments. And even the ones we're sharing, there are many, many, many listeners for which the baby did not live.
That's right.
For which the son or daughter did not return home. There are just so many of those realities that holding on to those gifts of goodness really hold us.
Yeah, I think, earlier in these conversations, David talked about his vows that he made to God. And when God started working our way out of debt, I made a vow to him that any time I had the opportunity, I would praise him publicly for what he had done for us. And me telling you all that story is a part of trying to keep that promise to the Lord.
Awesome.
Because he deserves to be praised. And David doesn't have any answers yet, but he's trusting and hoping in what God will do in the future. And then he closes with a vow of praise. Viv, would you read Psalm 61, verse 8 for us?
So I will sing praise to your name forever, that I may pay my vows day by day.
I will sing praise to your name forever. Do you like to sing praise to the Lord?
Well, you were asking about how do we, and Viv shared the tears, and then Daniel, you talked about writing things down, and I was thinking, well, sometimes I like to dance and sing, just to twirl in a circle,
That seems to be David's kind of default response. He writes a song about it, and we get to celebrate those songs these many years later. And when you sing praise to the Lord, how important is music to you in your spiritual life? And is there a particular musical genre that fits your praise best?
I have different playlists for different times and periods, because in the same way that smell can take you right back to a moment, certain music will take me back to a certain season.
Yeah, I wonder too if maybe part of the invitation David gives us by being someone who also wrote a lot of poetry is for each of us to just express in the way that we express how God is good and what he's done. And I think one of the things we've lost culturally is like folk song like singing, where you would have an idea or see God show up or be struggling with something and you just put it naturally to song, even if it doesn't rhyme and it feels clunky. Even just taking a simple idea about how God has shown up or something we're grateful for or whatever, and even grabbing a melody we know really well, but putting our own words to it. Those could be some ways that it feels really personal and even more, I don't know, like emotional in a sense with God, because we're using the words that we have and not only the words that are given to us. So maybe that's another thing we could do as well.
That's good, Daniel. Well, thank you all for these conversations on Psalm 61. I think there's been a richness to it that you all have contributed, and I'd like for us to end this set of conversations the way we started, and that's by reading the entire psalm together. So, Daniel, you want to kick us off?
Sure. To the leader with stringed instruments of David, hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I.
For you have been a refuge for me, a tower of strength against the enemy. Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge in the shelter of your wings. Selah.
God, you have heard my vows. You have given a heritage to those who hear your name. Add days to the king's life. May his years span many generations.
May he be enthroned in God's presence forever. Appoint your love and faithfulness to protect him. Then I will ever sing in praise of your name and fulfill my vows day after day.
Psalm 61, a psalm of real security. And another example of what Bill said when this edition of the podcast started. That's one of the reasons why we are so drawn to the Psalms, is that there is a psalm for virtually every struggle we face in life. The perspective and comfort and encouragement and the permission to be honest with what we say to God. All of that is why we love the Psalms. Bill Crowder, Elisa Morgan, Daniel Ryan Day, and Vivian Mabooney are on the table with you for another session of Engaging the Scriptures here on Discover the Word. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. And just two quick things as we close this edition. One, don't forget to go to our discovertheword.org website and take the survey. We want to know what you think and get to know you better. There's a banner up at the top of the page that'll take you to this new Discover the Word survey at discovertheword.org. And then two, Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries. And when you partner with us, whether through prayer, financial gifts, or spreading the word about us, then you're making it possible for us to continue connecting people with the story of Jesus around the world. We hear from people in prison cells, in hospital beds, at kitchen tables, and beyond, who find Jesus or more of him through our resources. If you'd like to partner with us financially, you can do that at discovertheword.org. Click on the Donate button. That's up at the top of the page. Thank you. Well, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Headinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministry.